Good afternoon to everybody who's tuning in. This is just kind of a quick 2-minute heads up. We will be starting at the top of the hour, 4 o'clock. Thank you. Once again, we will be starting the program here in about 1 minute. Starting in about 1 minute. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Stansberry. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for the Division of Student Affairs here at East Carolina University. I'm honored to serve as the moderator for today's Cupola Conversation. It is called Decision 2020, Bridging the Divide. You know, as we grow closer to Election Day 2020 every day, important conversations, they must be had. As we saw firsthand on Tuesday night, these conversations can be chaotic and uncomfortable, but it's also important here on a college campus that our students, our faculty, and our staff get the opportunity to engage in civil discourse on an important topic like a presidential and even state elections. If this is your first time joining Cupola Conversations, welcome. We're happy to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back. Cupola Conversations is part of the ECU United initiative that started by a student leader back in 2016, along with partnership with the Division of Student Affairs. We, at that time, the world was hurting, struggling, seemed broken, and maybe going in the wrong direction. And in 2020, we are still dealing with a lot of those same feelings across the country. ECU United is not intended to fix the entire world all at once, but rather to start right here on our campus and grow out from there. I encourage you to visit the ECU United website to learn more about the initiative, as well as now more than a dozen programs that fit under the ECU United umbrella. In short, ECU United is about one student, one faculty member, one staff member, one at a time, coming together and standing together to make our campus better. And then from there, we are empowered to make the world influencing meaningful change going forward. All right, for our conversation, we got a great discussion today coming up for Bridging the Divide. Some ground rules. Ideally, we'd be doing this in person, a lot more interactive, a lot more engaging. Unfortunately, it's the world that we live in. We are going to continue to have this conversation even virtually because it's very important for us to do that. So there may be some tech glitches here and there. We hope not, but if so, bear with us and we will move right along as best we can. For our format today, we have two great guests to talk about the upcoming election in North Carolina, but also for the country itself. We have some questions for our guests that we've already prepared, but we also want to hear from you in the audience as well. So for those of you that are watching, you have your microphones and audio, first of all, are silenced just so that we can avoid any noise and audio interference of that kind. But during the discussion, we do want to hear from you. If you have questions for our guests that you would like for them to discuss, please go up to the Q&A feature up at the top. It's got a question mark in the boxes right there. You can type in there. We've got student affairs professionals here on site that will be able to take those questions. They're going to compile them. They'll get them over to me and I can ask our guests. We may not be able to get to everybody's, but in the hour that we have, we do want to try to get to as many as possible. So let's start. A quick introduction for our speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Luis Miranda. He is the Director of Communications and Politics at Alloy. a nonprofit tech company that builds data solutions for Democratic and progressive campaigns. He previously served as the communications advisor to President Barack Obama during his first term in the White House and served as communications director for the Democratic National Committee through 2016's presidential primaries. Lewis has worked as a consultant on issues ranging from climate change to broadband access to data privacy, and has led the message campaign for the coalition credited with building public support for the president's change to U.S. Cuba policy in 2014. He is a regular appearances on CNN, Fox News Channel, Bloomberg, MSNBC, and more. Please welcome Mr. Louis Miranda. Thank you, Louis, for being here today. Our other guest, Mr. Dallas Woodhouse, is an experienced nonprofit manager with a track record of growing organizations in terms of members and revenue. He has spent 2 decades examining and managing political and policy operations as a political news reporter, advocate, and leader of 3 nonprofit organizations. 2019-2020, he served as the director of strategic initiatives for the Civitas Institute, a Raleigh-based nonprofit policy organization group. While the executive director of the North Carolina Republican Party, the NCGOP, Woodhouse oversaw the most successful NCGOP elections ever in 2016. During his time as the North Carolina State Director for Americans for Prosperity, he worked with citizen activists, community leaders, and state officials to implement large-scale tax relief and reform. He increased active membership by 300% and increased annual revenues by over 200%.
Okay, I'm the Republican. That's all they need to know. Louis is the Democrat. Let's get on with it.
Well, there you go. And so the show shall begin. So before we get going, we've got questions right there. You can see how maybe our program is going to go back and forth. We're going to have a little fun in the middle of this conversation too. But we do have some data and some information that we want to share to get going. So I'm going to put the slides up on the screen here. And I think, Dallas, you want to start walking us through, and then Louis is going to chime in as we go.
So Civitas is a North Carolina-based public policy think tank and research center. We do lean to the right. We do sort of support and advocate for conservative public policy, but we also do live monthly polling. Our polling operation is somewhat separate. It is done by Harper Polling, a very reputable polling firm. So we don't game the results. The results are what they are. This poll was taken the 17th through the 20th. The sample was 612 likely voters across North Carolina. This is a North Carolina-based poll, and 612 is a very good sample across the state of North Carolina. Just want to show you a couple of the top issues here in North Carolina, and we're waiting for the next slide to come up. So this gives you an idea of where things are across North Carolina. This is what we call the generic ballot for state legislature. If the 2020 election for North Carolina legislature, would you vote for? As you see, Democrats have a 2-point here, 46-44. That lead is slightly narrower than it was in August. That was a 4-point advantage for the Democrats. 2-point advantage is not something Republicans need to be too worried about. Of course, you know, we're not electing the legislature on a statewide basis. They're in districts, but it gives you an idea of where North Carolina is pretty evenly divided. We'll go to the next slide. We have, of course, 3 state Supreme Court races up in North Carolina. We have a Chief Justice race, that is Justice Paul Newby versus the appointed current Chief Justice, the Democrat Sherry Beasley. That's an important race. There are also 2 other Associate Justice races. Those are going to be important. Again, shows you how divided it is, North Carolina, 43 and 43. Just gives you a feel of where North Carolina is. Sure, we'll talk more about this a little later. Next slide. I'm going to talk more about this in a minute, but this shows you where the president's job approval is. And as you can see, the squiggly lines, red is the disapproval, green is the approval. If you look at the end, we have the president in September as being 51 in his job approval, 46 in his disapproval. That is markedly better and a change from what we had a month previous in August, where he was upside down with 52 disapproval and 47 approval. Louis, any thoughts on that?
I think this is a good slide that also shows you the impact of COVID, where the big drop there towards March 17th and through April and May is largely a reflection of how people saw his handling of COVID. And it's why he's trying to move past it, and why it's going to continue to be an issue that people talk about. And you know, the reality is that a large part of the country, more than 20 states, are seeing their highest numbers of COVID. So you're going to continue to see this probably tip again in the other direction as more and more states go through what's arguably the first wave or the beginning of the second.
I certainly hope he's not correct, but I agree with that. And I would say that as COVID has moved out of the news some more, the job approval has moved up. If we can move on to the next slide. So this is something that we do interesting. So ours is some people do automated polls. Ours is a live survey. So we have live operators. And one of the things that we do is we ask people in what we call an open-ended question. In your own words, what national issue would you consider to be the most important when you're thinking about your vote in November? As you can see, the most often answer we got is COVID and the pandemic. That was number one. The economy was number two, and healthcare. It is interesting that if you go way down towards the end, Trump is way down towards the bottom. So that gives you some idea. And what I would say is that it gives you a good summary of what people are thinking. But of course, COVID means a lot of things to a lot of people. Is it their own personal health care? Is it the frustration with things being closed, or thinking more things should be closed? You know, do some people talk about health care in that sense, or did they also answer separately with health care? But it gives you some idea. Louis?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think, you know, not a lot of disagreement yet. You see that COVID is obviously, this reflects the same thing we saw in the previous slide, that concern is going to reflect in how people view the president's job performance. And it also shows the volatility that he has, because the economy, its recovery, that's linked to COVID. Obviously, if we don't get the virus under control, we can't get the economy under control. We can't get it back to where it needs to be. And then the president is campaigning on ending Obamacare with a case that's about to head to the Supreme Court. And that's going to play into these approval ratings as people focus in on that. Just as we saw during 2018, when healthcare was a big issue that certainly played a big role in Democrats recapturing control of the House of Representatives and being able to change things up a little bit.
Next slide. So this is an interesting question and I think we'll need to dive into this a little bit later in more detail. What method best describes the way you plan on voting you can say a plurality of people still are planning on voting on election day, but that is less than a majority, and the number of people voting on election day continues to go down, and that heavily weights towards Republicans. Republicans are twice as likely as Democrats to vote on election day. On the flip side, Democrats are nearly 3 times as likely to vote by mail. Unaffiliated voters are fairly split. I will say that compared to the last month, the number of people that said they're going to vote by mail has gone down by 4 percentage points. It is interesting to note that you still have, nearly 80% you know, I guess a couple of people didn't respond or weren't sure. You still have, 75 or 80% saying in North Carolina they are going to vote in person one way or the other. The mail ballots, I'm sorry, go ahead, Louis.
I was going to say, when you look at this, you also see what the assault on mail ballots, where that's coming from for the president, because in certain states, he's going to look at this and see that Republicans perform better on day of election voting, and Democrats are performing better on early vote or vote by mail. And that's where you see those attacks coming from. The problem for the president is that that's not universal. Republicans have tended to do better on absentee voting, for example, in Florida, in mail voting. And you see the Florida Republican Party working very hard to remind people that it's still safe and that they can vote by mail, even as the president is trying to send the opposite message. But this is a great chart to really illustrate where that divide comes from. And you also see just the shift here. You see that 56% of the respondents here are not going to vote on election day. They're going to vote before, and it really speaks to a couple of dynamics. You have obviously COVID. There's a lot of people who are wanting to limit their exposure, whether it's by mail or going, in theory, to a less populated opportunity to vote before election day during early vote. But this was also a trend that was just taking hold before, because it's the limited window on election day has always been a limiting factor, and giving people the option to early vote is the best way to give them the chance to exercise their most fundamental right as Americans.
Okay, well, number one, if we can back up just a second, because this is an important issue. Number one, if you were trying to limit your exposure to the coronavirus, voting in person early would be a dumb way to do it. Because what we have done in North Carolina is, you're never, ever going to stand in line in North Carolina voting on election day, because there are tons and tons more precincts to vote on election day than there are early voting sites. The places you're going to see lines are in early voting sites. Number two, and Lewis brings up about the president and the issues nationally. North Carolina, we have a major issue where we're fighting over absentee ballots by mail, and this is because the Democrats have engaged in some real shenanigans. It deals with several lawsuits where they have tried to settle lawsuits that go against written state law. They have, this deals with trying to waive a witness requirement for ballots. They were just extremely chastised yesterday by a federal judge. And here is what this amounts to a problem, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this later in detail. This amounts to a real challenge the Democrats have put themselves in. The fact is that if people are otherwise qualified voters and they're registered, and you go vote in person, there's almost no chance your vote's not going to count. But there is a significant error rate when people vote by mail. That includes people forgetting to sign their ballot envelope, people forgetting to get a witness to sign it. And the error rate, averages somewhere between 5, 7 to 8%. It's not insignificant. Now, the error rate might be the same on both sides for Democrats and Republicans. But if Democrats have 200,000 or 300,000 more people choosing to vote that way, the potential for lost votes on Democrats is significant. And that is why they've been trying to change the rules in the middle of the game. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. So let's go on to the next slide.
So real quick, jumping in there, I know I want to get to the questions, and I know some folks are already starting to submit questions too. So I want to ask Dallas, do you want to zip through some of these? Or
yeah, we'll get through this real quick. I'll move through them real quick.
Perfect.
So this is the money slide. This tells you where the presidential race is. We have it as the president 45, Biden 44. This is in line with whatever surveys have shown. We had it reversed the month before. We had it Biden 45 and the president 44. The one thing I will say is we showed the president's approval rating having gone up. If that is usually a leading indicator. So if the president's job approval were to stay higher, he'll probably improve on the ballot. But if, as Lewis said, it goes down, he probably won't improve on the ballot. Next slide. Okay, so we have Tillis 6 points down. This is in the U.S. Senate race. Most polls have Tillis underperforming the president by 4 or 5 points. I will say this, the president underperforms with Trump voters. There's potentially no election in the country where a incumbent could benefit, I'm not saying he will, could benefit more from the Supreme Court nomination than Tom Tillis, because he's on the Judiciary Committee and he trails with people that are going to vote for Trump. And so seeing him stand up for the Republican nominee might help Tillis, but it might not be enough. I'll bring up some more about the Senate race in a minute that I think is interesting. Next slide. We continue to show Roy Cooper in pretty good shape. We have him up 7 points. This has narrowed some over time. The governor has significantly more money, and governors rarely lose re-election. They have a higher re-elect rate than members of Congress or about anybody else. And is that our last one? Okay, so I'll stop there. So look, it's close.
Wonderful. Yeah,
it's very close in North Carolina.
Yeah, so I would be remiss if we didn't get started with the most recent events being from Tuesday. And so I'm going to start with Lewis on this question and then have Dallas chime in after that. With what we've heard, both sides of the aisle using words like embarrassing, absurd, unpresidential, chaotic, things like that. It doesn't matter which party it is. Everybody's using similar descriptions. Not asking who won or lost, but in your opinion, that first of 3 debates, what impact do you think that's going to have on voters?
I think it has the kind of effect that Donald Trump wants it to have, which is that it could depress turnout. It could make people just sick and disgusted with politics and with the democratic process. And that's the biggest threat to our democracy. Look, at the end of the day, we live in a system of government that we have to believe is legitimate and that we have to support the institutions if they're going to survive and thrive. We have to believe that when the Justice Department or when judges or when government acts, that we can trust that. And so if you undermine the entire process, if you undermine the sense of legitimacy, you're just trying to get people to not participate. And so then we all lose. So I think it was incredibly damaging for our democracy from that perspective. I also think it's short-sighted. I think even if there's a short-term gain among his base, particularly when he took a moment to not denounce white supremacists and seemingly asking Proud Boys to stand by, I think that's the kind of moment that I think is going to work against not just Donald Trump, but the Republican Party in the long term. And that it has a lot of consequences. So overall, it was ugly for American democracy. And it just reiterates that, we have to come together as a country. At the end of the day, being a schoolyard bully isn't the way that we need to govern, because we have to bring the kind of Dallas and his brother are I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary on them, but it's really terrific, because as much as they're fiercely on opposite sides of the political spectrum, they're brothers. They have families that come together. They're one and the same, and so that's the kind of dynamic that you really have to respect if we're going to respect the political process, is that we're all in it together.
Yeah, I don't buy anything Lewis just said, but I appreciate his nice comments about my family. First of all, the president the president said, and he has said many times, he's not for white supremacy. I also think it was obnoxious that he's asked to condemn some group when the violence in the streets we're seeing are not by that side, it's by the left side, but that's fine. Seems like to me we're having a great conversation today. I don't see any threats to democracy. People are going to vote. People are going to vote in record numbers. Democracy's fine. They're going to have 2 more debates. I don't think it probably attracted a lot of decisions from undecided voters, but a lot of times first debates don't do that. And I think there'll be a better format going forward. I do think Trump and the Republicans made some mistakes about setting the bar so low for Joe Biden. It was like, just if he showed up, that was going to be a success. I think the president made a mistake in talking too much. I think he needed to let Biden answer more, because the more Biden talks, the more he gets in trouble. I think it's for Biden that he won't answer what his view on the court is, and Democrats plan to pack the courts. I think to hear more of Biden's views, and the president does get himself in trouble when he talks too much. So nothing about that debate was dispositive, and we have 30 some more days to go.
Dallas, coming back to you on this, I want to follow up. You talked about some of the topics from the poll: COVID, economy, healthcare, people, police, law. Here at ECU, the students and the faculty and staff this summer has been really dominated by the topic of systemic racism, law enforcement engagement, et cetera. From your individual perspectives, as you talk about higher education and college age students, what are the topics that are probably the most appealing with this upcoming election?
Well, it's interesting. I often get this question when I talk to college groups. First of all, nobody should ever, if you're a college student, should go vote thinking like a college student. Okay, don't ever do that. That's a dumb idea. Because unless you're going to medical school, unless you're going to law school, or unless you're just spending your parents' money, wasting your time, by the time we do the next presidential election, you're not going to be in college. You're going to be working, and you probably, maybe not, have met your future life mate. And by the time we do this a second time, and we elect, by the time we get to the second presidential election, you very well may be a parent. So these people talk about free college tuition and all this other stuff that comes up. That ain't gonna help you, and it's a terrible idea. It destroys the university. Universities provide something of value, and people ought to pay for it. Look, I think at the end of the day, people want safe communities, and I think that's a big issue. And we've seen that change in a lot of polls that this rampant. Look, I've been in Raleigh my whole life. I went to Campbell, but I've always had my voter registration there, my master's at State. We've had Democrats run the city of Raleigh most of my lifetime. One or two Republicans for a few years, but they've always been pretty good mayors, and we've kept the streets safe and picked up the trash. And we've had riots in downtown Raleigh, and we've had businesses shut for months, and then the governor let the state capitol grounds be overtaken. Hell, we have a police force in the state of North Carolina that does nothing to protect the Capitol, and we allowed that to happen. That ought to enrage everybody in this state. That of course people have a right to protest. They have a right to protest. Nobody has a right to break the law. And to me, that is one of the most important things in this election. Other people may feel differently.
And you know what, though? I think part of the problem has been the misrepresentation of who's actually responsible for violence and who's actually creating more of a crisis. When you look at the vast majority of people who've been protesting over the last several months, it's been peaceful. And when there have been instances where somebody's trying to incite incidents of violence, it's often found to be people associated with white supremacist groups who are trying to create a situation where it looks like the protesters are violent. The FBI itself, this is Donald Trump's appointed director to the FBI, Christopher Wray, said to Congress that Antifa is not even an actual organization. It's an ideology, and spoke about the concern over white supremacist groups. And Donald Trump is feeding into that. And so when you talk about safety and people feeling safe, unfortunately, what comes across to a lot of folks is that it's coded language for minorities. You talk about the way that Donald Trump talks about the suburbs. He's basically saying, keep Cory Booker out of your suburbs. He's saying keep African Americans out of your suburbs in not so coded, very.
It was Joe Biden. It was Joe Biden. It was Joe Biden who, talking about housing policy, who said he didn't want his neighborhood turned into a jungle. Number one, that was Joe Biden, not Donald Trump. Number two, in North Carolina, that hasn't happened in North Carolina. Look at the arrest record. But by the way, I don't want to sit here and argue about what groups are doing what. Criminals are criminals. I'm not going to sit and debate about the race of criminals. And what we have not done is the elected people
at those protests. And we should be celebrating that. And we should welcome the fact that there's a movement in this country to say there are social injustices, there is systemic racism that we need to address. And instead of trying to respond to it with violent reactions to protesters, figure out how do we elevate this issue of dealing with systemic racism. And look, this is why Joe Biden, I think, is gaining so much strength right now, even across the South. I mean, there's Joe Biden is as likely to win a state like South Carolina or Alaska as Donald Trump is to win a state like Michigan or Wisconsin, which he needs to be able to win, by the way. Donald Trump needs those states. Joe Biden could win without winning South Carolina and Alaska. But the fact that they're so close, if you look at a bunch of recent polling, tells you that people in the middle, people who are either undecided, you said there's not that much of an undecided vote, it's shrinking. But the reality is that the white working class vote that left the Democratic Party to help Donald Trump gain election in 2016 is turned off by the kind of politics that Donald Trump has been practicing, that is all about a base that is far to the right of where I believe you are and where the vast majority of voters, not just in North Carolina, but across the country are. And so I think that changes it. And at the same time, we have to take this away from just Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is capitalizing on an anger and a part of the Republican base that had been building there for years.
I'm going to jump in real quick and we'll move on. Real fast.
Yeah, real quick.
I promise you, the white working class and white women in the suburbs are not for a bunch of windows smashed in downtown, and they're not for cars being surrounded on Capitol Boulevard in Raleigh. They are not for that. I promise you that. No matter who's doing it.
Also not for systemic racism.
All right, so I'm going to pull my best Chris Wallace, and I'm going to try and move us on to a different topic as we go forward here, because we are getting questions, and I appreciate the conversation, but we are starting to get questions here that are coming in, and I want to from the chat. So in the Q&A area, if you want to pop those in there, we'll get to as many as we can. And this maybe kind of goes back and forth where people may, from a different perspective, be thinking the two of you are really upset and angry about each other versus debating a topic. So the question here that comes in from one of our audience members is, what is the role of a political figure to promote authentic civil discourse? And that's not necessarily what we're seeing early on with the debate and what we may be seeing going on. What is the role of the political figures to have some credibility through civil discourse? And I'll start with Dallas on that one.
I mean, I don't think we ought to be into name calling, but, everybody always has recency bias. They think that this is the worst time. I remember we had a vice president who shot somebody. Okay. We had senators that caned each other on the floor of the U.S. Senate. The country survived a civil war. These are tough issues. Elections by themselves are not meant to bring people together. They're meant to settle differences. And then, later legislators come together and try to solve problems. And by the way, the left spied on the president. I get so sick and tired of hearing about this. Is the president going to accept the election results? The other side never accepted when he won in 2016. So I guess, now look, I don't take this stuff personally. Lewis and I having a great conversation. I would have a cigar with him, so I don't lose sleep over this stuff. But yes, I think people ought to promote civil discourse. But I think people ought to be passionate about their feelings. It's what makes America great. Now, I do see things that I think are ridiculous when, my wife was telling me a story about some friend of hers that's in a wine club that meets once a month, and she quit because one of them was a Trump wine drinker. And I thought, well, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, you should, all your life shouldn't be decided on politics. I mean, my advice is don't let politics, don't worry about the politics and civil discourse. Don't let politics overtake your life.
Lewis?
I think politicians have a huge responsibility, and I think this is on both sides. I think, we have to denounce violence on both sides and denounce the ugly rhetoric on both sides, regardless of where it comes from. Look, we had a deranged gunman that went out and shot up a baseball field with members of Congress who were Republican just a couple of years ago. And that was a heinous act. And we have to make sure to say it was a heinous act on our side, as much as Republicans have a responsibility to recognize that the president's rhetoric and the way that he talks about whether it's violence against reporters or talking up groups like Proud Boys or what he was doing yesterday in Minnesota sparks violence. It sparks tensions. It sparks bullying at schools, and we can't accept that. We need to have political leaders who recognize that they have a voice that goes far beyond their own political interests, and that we all have a responsibility to build an America that is going to be welcoming of those of us who are here, and that's going to be able to give us all a fair shot without fearing that our kids are going to school being bullied and attacked or having to fear violence.
For God's sakes, bullying in schools, like there hadn't been bullying in schools since the beginning of school. That's Donald Trump's fault.
Well, Donald Trump
kids don't lean on the weak kids. Not that I'm for bullying in schools, but come on. All right, let's. I mean,
it's a good pivot. It's a good pivot, Dallas. But the issue is there, which is that Donald Trump has to take responsibility for the rhetoric that he's elevating and what it's leading to in our country. And when he tells people to stand by, because if he doesn't like the election,
you gonna do like the Democrats did and blame Donald Trump for fire too, like they did with the fire out in Western. Anyway, go ahead. All right.
Well, Donald Trump blames the trees for the forest fire. So I mean, that's a whole other issue that we can get into. But at the end of the day, what you're seeing and what your own poll reflects, Dallas, is that there is a changing electorate. And if you look at North Carolina, just between mid-August and mid-September, you saw that you had more people register to vote as unaffiliated than either Republican or Democrat. But you also had the vast majority of people who were registering to vote, or the plurality at least, 18 to 29, and then 29 to 44. So you have a younger electorate that is coming into play. You have people who are seeing the world in a different way, who recognize that you need political leaders who are not trying to ignore issues, whether it's climate change or systemic racism, and who want political leaders that are going to bring us together as opposed to keep driving us apart. And that's a reality.
So real quick before we get to our next question,
they're coming in pretty good, so I want to make sure we get to as many.
I'll make this fast. Lewis just brought up two things that I think would be interesting to our viewers. Since Donald Trump came onto the scene, and Lewis is right that there is a vast increase in unaffiliated voters, but I will tell you, and I give this speech a lot, the biggest reason people are registered unaffiliated voters are not because people have a pox on both their houses or upset with both political parties. I mean, there's some of that, but the biggest reason people are registering unaffiliated is they're not affiliating with anything. They're not joining the JCs. They're not joining the Lions Club. They're joining non-denominational churches. But when it comes to partisan voter registration, this is something to think about in this election, that if you look at what the Democrats have lost since the 2016 election, the Democrats have gone down and Republicans have gone up. The Republicans have gained 200,000 more voter registrations than Democrats in North Carolina. That is an issue. Another thing I want to point about the Senate race, real quickly, Tom Tillis is really an underdog. I was born in 1973, and there have been 9 U.S. senators in North Carolina. 7 of them, 7 have been one-term senators. 5 were defeated for re-election after one term. 1, John Edwards, ran for president, and John East, who of course was an ECU professor, died in office. So Tom Tillis really is an underdog, even though he's the incumbent.
So I want to get to as many of these questions. They're coming in pretty good. So I'm not going to say shorten your answers because it's very important that we hear from you on these specific things. But we had some questions we want to get to, and I'm going to start with Lewis on this next one coming forward, because a word he mentioned just a minute ago was rhetoric. It ties in very nicely to where we were going with this. There's a lot of rhetoric concerning barriers and unfair practices with voting. There's concerns with mail-in voting and those types of things. So talk a little bit about that from this perspective, both of you, the concerns and issues related to effective voting and tracking mechanisms as we go in forward with this election. Lewis?
Yeah, I think, look, we should always be vigilant of our voting systems. I think one of the problems we have as a country is that we have inconsistent voting systems, not just from state to state, but even within states. And so we need to do a better job of being on top of what those systems are and making sure that election security technology is in place to protect voting, that there's paper ballots to be able to account for whatever the electronic systems are telling us. And so those are legitimate issues that we should be always vigilant of. But I think the problem right now is that you have one party that has settled on following talking points that essentially echo Russian propaganda to try to undermine our democracy and to try to say that you can't trust American democracy. And that's incredibly dangerous for the American experiment that is just 244 years old here, where we depend on to be able to succeed is people believing in the legitimacy and people respecting it and people participating and people knowing that their voices can be heard. And if you're still seeing protests, if you're still seeing tensions over any number of issues, it's because we've not been a fully successful democracy. Not everyone has always had their voices heard, but we've always had a place in America where we're looking to improve and where we create the political space to be able to make those improvements. And so to threaten the institutions and to undermine the pieces of this democratic puzzle that enable those voices to rise, to continually improve American democracy so that more voices are heard and can participate is extremely dangerous, and that worries me. But from a perspective of security of voting, by and large, we have voting security. It'd be great if the Senate would get off sitting off its hands and pass some of the election security measures that the House passed previously, actually take it seriously. But we can trust that there is a lot in place, even as we hope that Congress would do more to help shore up our elections.
Real quickly,
as you reply into that too, think about it from the college student perspective, other things college students need to be careful of and aware of as you kind of respond to that too.
Well, okay. So first of all, I think the president has been inarticulate in some of his criticism, but I think he is right that it is irresponsible for states, and we don't do this in North Carolina, to send out ballots to people who have not requested them. That is just grossly irresponsible. If you've ever been around election rolls, they are not clean, they're not scrubbed, and so he's bringing up a legitimate issue. In North Carolina, we have efforts to change the rules while the process is going on. Normally, courts don't like that. So the best way to have a functioning system is to have clear, bright line rules and do not alter them. And sure as hell don't alter them, when we get close to an election. Number two, we have to hold voters somewhat accountable for their actions. Voters should be expected to show up at the right precinct to vote. Voters should be expected to follow the instructions. And yes, they ought to have a chance to correct their mistakes, but there is some voter responsibility that ought to be a principle in our system. When it comes to college students, I would say that college students have a duty under the law to vote where they reside. If they are residents, if they go to ECU, but they are residents in another state, they should be voting there. I don't personally like, and I don't agree with court decisions that I do not believe that any college student should be registering to vote in a dorm. Now, the law allows them to do that. A dorm cannot be used for a residency for any other purpose. Now, that is the law, and students have a right to do it. But I think an honest answer is that they should be registering to vote where their parents live, because that is where they reside. Now, if you're in an off-campus apartment and that is really where you reside and you have an intent to return there, I think that's different. But in all honesty, ECU students, about where they vote, they need to ask themselves where they have their car registered. Because if your car's not registered there, that is a sign of where your residence is and where you expect to return.
Well, I would just say one of the reasons we scheduled this event when we did too is because October 9th is the voter registration deadline. So people still have the opportunity to register. And that's, I think, what we hope to do here is, whether you're on Dallas's side or mine on a lot of these issues, is participate, vote. Sure. More need to take ownership over this democracy if we're going to have it succeed. So.
Thank you very much for that. It's a very important point, and that's exactly why we picked this time frame. Another question that came in from one of our audience members. let's see, related to, I just lost the question there a second ago. Oh, here it is for both of you, and I'll go back with Dallas for this one to start. You mentioned during the slides earlier about how close North Carolina is going to be. With such an even political split between the parties in North Carolina, regardless of who wins, how do you encourage bipartisan cooperation at a state level? Dallas?
Well, we've had trouble with that. I think the way you do it is you have to find things you agree on, but ultimately the things you don't agree on. And the system finds itself a way to work itself out. I mean, there are simply things that both sides cannot agree on. And I think you have to accept that. There's some things that there cannot be agreement on, and you have to have that honest reality.
Louis, do you want to weigh in there?
Sure. I think, bipartisanship it works to the extent that voters hold their elected officials accountable. I ended up
I think that's true.
Doing an event with Chris Christie on the future of work, because there's very real issues that we have to start looking at. I think one of the problems with the partisan divide is that you often get lost in a very core set of issues and you miss sight of all the things that are happening. Even before COVID, we were on track to lose 30% of jobs over the next 10 years, according to a PricewaterhouseCoopers study and others like it, not because of immigrants or minorities or protesters or anything else, but because of automation and AI, self-driving truck fleets that are going to put truck drivers out of work in the next 10, 15 years. There was already something like that happening, but politicians don't focus on those things or don't look at them until they become a crisis, because voters aren't holding them accountable to that, right? And so I think that's part of it, is how do we look at the big issues that you're going to have to deal with no matter what, and try to put aside the partisanship to focus on, like, look, whether we're Republican or Democrat, we're going to have to address this. There's going to be a lot of people out of work, no matter who's in charge. And how do we deal with it? Whether you want to believe climate change is led by science or not, it's happening. And so how do we deal with it? How do we deal with the fact that, in the Carolinas, there have been big fights over how insurance, how the state talks about the threat to the Barrier Islands just because insurance companies wouldn't insure the homes there, right? And so you, at some point, you have to be able to say, like, look, this is a big enough issue that we have to stop thinking of this through a partisan lens and look at it through a reality of what do we do for the people who do have their homes there, whose property is threatened? What do we do to actually deal with the insurance losses that might cause? How do we prepare the state for the tremendous damage and shifts that are going to occur over the next 20 years if we don't deal with climate change now and put those things aside? And that's why you need responsible leadership that looks beyond their own self-interest. And I think that's why, despite the 200,000 voter edge in registrations that Dallas was talking about, you see that in the presidential race, it's a dead heat. And Biden's coming up ahead in a lot of other polls. He was slightly down within a point on the Civitas one, but he's ahead by a point or two on the trends in a lot of the others. And you see that despite that voter registration shift, in part because those dynamics are real and people want leadership that's actually addressing those issues.
I want to say something about bipartisanship, because I think there's a real misconception. Number one, bipartisanship works when it has to. And I'll give you an example. I mean, we had a big coronavirus bill here in the state legislature right before an election that passed overwhelmingly bipartisan, and the governor signed it. Most of the things that pass in the state legislature are done on a bipartisan basis. There's 4 or 5 bills that the governor may veto and there's disagreement on. There's actually a tremendous amount of bipartisanship that goes on in our state. It doesn't get a lot of news. Even when the governor hasn't agreed to a budget, 90% of the budgets between the two of them are in agreement anyway. So the truth of it is there's a lot more agreement than people realize.
And it's actually kind of nice to have such a close split, because in a state like North Carolina, you're forced to have some sort of bipartisan deal because the state is split. And at the end of the day, politics is a reflection of who we are. And if we hold people accountable, it makes sense.
So one of the things I want to bring up, this goes to a question that came in from one of our viewers, is we've started to hear more conversation about people questioning the election process. They're questioning, we have candidates that when they reach the end of a term, if elected, will be close to 80. We have questioning about the individual processes at all. This goes to my question here that came in from one of the audience members. They would love to know both of your perspectives on term limits. So Lewis, I'll start with you and then go to Dallas.
I personally love that idea. That's not a Democratic platform thing or anything like that, but individually, personally, I think term limits are a good thing and we should explore them. The argument against term limits is often that if you don't have elected officials who can stay on, you essentially lose a lot of institutional knowledge as people cycle out, and that you end up putting control of government in the hands of lobbyists. I would argue that happens a lot already, that lobbyists have way too much influence on our politics, and that at the end of the day, I think we do need a lot of fresh thinking. I think we do need a lot of new ideas. There's a huge shift in demographically and how this country is thinking about a lot of issues that often isn't reflected in Washington because it's still in another generation. And so I do think that it is an issue that's worth exploring.
So two different things. I used to be for term limits, but I deal a lot in the state, like legislatures, and other states that have adopted them, I don't think have ended up with better governance. And Lewis mentioned the problem with lobbyists being in control, but in a lot of those states, it appears that legislative staff who are not accountable to the people have assumed a lot of powers. So I would have some questions about it. I do not think it would be bad, when we started giving federal judges lifetime appointments, they didn't live to 90. I do not think some kind of conversation about, 25 or 30-year appointments for federal judges, something that makes them well beyond, being able to get them, as a way of retribution might be worth a discussion. I would say this would make their retirements very political. They would all a lot of them would deem their retirements when it might be politically advantageous. So, I'm not sure it would be a good idea, but it might be something we want to discuss. I don't know that that picking judges when they're really, really young and keeping them till they are, geriatric is the best idea.
Want to transition work. We got about 8 minutes left in the program here and a couple of questions we want to get to. Go right back to you, Dallas, with this question. With a lot of the conversation, I talk about people are questioning the process. They're questioning age of candidates. They're talking about mail-in versus face. There's a lot of question about the process. And then the way the first debate went, obviously, I think there'll be some changes to try and figure out how we can have more of a debate discussion rather than interrupting, talking over top of each other. So, Dallas, for you, do you worry about voters becoming disillusioned, and maybe that actually leads, whether it's this election or the one 4 years from now, that people will not believe in it and may actually stop going to exercise that right to vote?
No.
How come?
I just think that, the person who asked that question can't believe that, because they wouldn't be on this webinar if they did. The end of the day, people are always going to be interested in the governance of their communities, and they're going to participate. The fact is, most people that are registered to vote will vote in presidential years. It's why when we do, and I did a lot dealing with turnout. We ought to talk a little bit about that before we're done. But, when we do turnout operations for presidential years, you try to change the electorate by registering more voters, because pretty much everybody who is registered and alive, once you give them a little push, they're going to vote. And that's pretty much the same every year in and year out. It varies a little bit. Midterm elections are different. You're trying to get people who vote primarily in presidential years, but not in midterm years, to come out and vote. So I just don't worry about that at all. I think, again, people have recency bias. We don't have anybody caning anybody. We don't have anybody shooting each other in duels. We don't have people publishing anonymous attacks. I mean, go back and read what they were doing in Ben Franklin's time. This is nothing compared to that.
Lewis?
I saw Hamilton, so I hear you, Dallas. But look,
I was just thinking that.
People do get discouraged, and this is why we're doing this event, is to encourage them, because you can make a difference. And right now maybe it's just your vote, but it makes an incredible difference. But there's other ways to get engaged and to make sure that your voices are heard. We have the Senate trying to ram through a Supreme Court nomination here that could potentially have damaging and long-lasting effects on the ability of women to fully participate in our economy and our society, as just one example. Not to mention any other number of issues. And you can pick up the phone and call your elected officials, call your senators, let them know that you don't want to see that happen. And so the best thing that can happen for the people that want to deny you rights is for you to get discouraged. The best thing that can happen for this democracy, for you, for the rights that we want to see our children have, is for people to stay engaged and participate. And this is why you see a regular battle where Democrats want to see higher voter turnout. Republicans like it when turnout is low because they're more likely to be getting out their people. Voter suppression has a better effect on Democrats who tend to respond to these types of voter suppression tactics in a way that Republicans don't. And that's why you do see it as a partisan dynamic. But the worst thing that we can do, or the best thing to help Donald Trump, is to get discouraged.
So we just had my fellow panelists say that confirming a well-accomplished woman who has 7 kids is going to keep women out of the economy. Now that's the kind of hyperbole that is just ridiculous. Anyway.
I wish it were, but you think about how recent the history is. I encourage people to watch the documentary on Ruth Bader Ginsburg and think about the fact that this was not that long ago that she couldn't get a job despite being first in her class coming out of law school because she was a woman. The things that she achieved to be able to open doors for women to be able to open their own bank accounts, to get their own mortgage.
And Amy Coney Barrett's going to take that away for every woman in the country? That's ridiculous. That is ridiculous.
And you gotta defend them.
All right, so I want to move real quick to our last question. I think this is, despite disagreement that may be between the two of you on many topics, I think this is going to be.
He's a nice guy.
I think this is going to be.
You work with my brother, and anybody who work with my brother, man, they need to sit at the right hand of God the Father Almighty.
So Dallas, since you're right there and your mic is hot, I'm going to ask you this question. First of all, East Carolina, the last 3 years, Washington Monthly's best colleges for student voting list. What would be your push to folks to talk about the importance of exercising their right to vote in the next couple of months? Talk about that and how that contributes to our nation's democracy.
Well, I mean, I have participated since I was at, and I think, you want to have a voice in your future. And I would encourage students to think about, what's going to keep their community safe, what's going to help them get a job, what's going to look out for the culture and fabric of America. And they should vote as where they want to see the country go when they're in their 30s and 40s and 50s, because that's how they're going to live most of their lives, not where they are today. Turnout in this election is going to be very interesting. It's going to be interesting to see, whether the Democrats' focus on the coronavirus, scaring the heck out of citizens across the country, is going to affect how many people come out to vote. And so the ECU students who vote might have a disproportionate impact on the election more times than others. I don't know that to be the case. But everybody has a right to have their voice heard, and in a lot of places you don't.
Lewis?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have to have our voices heard, and we have to also understand the stakes and the impact that we can have. Sometimes it can feel like, oh, well, my vote might not make a difference. It does. It makes a tremendous difference. I worked in Florida. My first presidential election was in 2000, working for Al Gore, and that was defined by 537 votes across the entire state. Incredibly small number of votes per precinct. You can just imagine just how close that is, and that's potentially what's going to decide this election. It might just be a couple more.
Ain't it hard to believe, Lewis? Ain't it hard to believe that you remember that like yesterday, and none of the kids that are in ECU were even born then? It's hard to believe,
That's
ain't
exactly right. We're getting old. For me, it feels like it just happened, but that's the truth, is that every vote makes a difference. And right at the end of the election in 2016, I went on a State Department program trip where we were trying to alleviate concerns for other countries, right? And so it was me and a Republican counterpart doing something along the lines of what me and Dallas are doing here, which is go out there and say, look, we have our differences, but at the end of the day, we're both Americans. Whoever wins, our institutions are going to survive. We're going to thrive. We're going to have a good relationship with your country. We're going to make this work. And I used to tell a joke. I used to say, we used to talk about in 2000 that if George W. Bush got elected, he'd wreck the economy, he'd start wars, he'd make a mess of everything. And sure enough, that happened. But, a Democrat came right back in after, and we fixed things, we patched things right back up. Our institutions are strong, and we'll be better for it. And if we'll do great. But here's the truth. Our actual institutions are in a moment of crisis. And if you look at even just the Department of Justice and Bill Barr basically acting as the president's personal lawyer, this is a moment at which your vote can make sure that the American democracy survives as it was intended to by the founding fathers, and that we don't become a corrupt image of other countries where we often go out and try to lecture them about how to run their democracies. We have such a potential here to either put our country back on the right track or let it continue to slide into corruption and demise, and your voice matters, and I hope you guys participate.
Yeah, always remember it's the most important election the country's ever had until the next one comes along and people tell you that again.
So as we wrap up, and Dallas, I've got you on the screen, 30 seconds, give me your closing thoughts for today.
I think one of the questions that we're going to have to watch in North Carolina is how this close election materializes on the ground where people vote. A couple of things that are not in favor of the Democrats. College campuses where Democrats get a lot of votes are somewhat in disarray across the state as far as mobilizing voters. They are shifting a lot of voters to mail-in vote, where they will lose some votes due to the error rate. And then there's the issue of how many of their voters are going to be concerned about coronavirus, because polls show that Democrats are a lot more scared of coronavirus than Republicans. That might amount all total to a point or two difference, and in a close election, that could be decisive.
Lewis?
Yeah, look, anything can be decisive right now, and at the end of the day, we don't know what's going to happen in this election. What I would say is that the results may also take a few days at the end of this, right? And that's normal. It's as we count absentee ballots, as more people participate through mail-in votes. We may not know the results on election day, but that's how democracy functions. You wait till the ballots are counted, and you don't let something gum up the works when ballots are being counted. Our military votes by mail. Our diplomats abroad vote by mail. I think we have to respect the process and let it play out.
Gentlemen, I thank you very much. A couple of reminders: October 9th, the voter registration deadline coming up. Make sure you're aware of your deadlines coming up, of what's happening in the next couple of weeks. Another program that East Carolina University is putting on, an Office of Equity and Diversity, along with Student Affairs. It's going off of the Skills for Bridging the Divide. It's a partnership with the Braver Angels nonprofit organization. You can go to the ECU United website to register for that and get participated on that. That's ecunited.ecu.edu.
Chris?
Yes, sir.
Chris, I am Dallas Woodhouse. I am on Facebook, and I am at the Civitas Institute at dallas.woodhouse@nccivitas.org. That's dallas.woodhouse@nccivitas.org. If you didn't get your question in today, or there's something you want to debate with me on or ask a question, I'll be glad to discuss it with you offline.
Lewis, do you want to share any contact info?
Likewise, I'm on Twitter at Louis Miranda, is just my name. Lucky enough to have one of those that picked up my actual name on Twitter. So feel free to check in with me there. Send me direct messages. I see some folks already retweeting here, and happy to engage. And let's keep this conversation going. And I want to thank you, Chris, and thank Associate Vice Chancellor Newell for inviting us, and everyone who worked on making this event possible across the student organizations and the faculty when we first tried to do this in March, and really excited that we were able to get it done now.
And Louis, I hope you have a great December and a lousy November. Just so you know.
Likewise, Dallas. Great to see you.
So as we wrap up, I want to encourage our folks. First of all, thanks for being a part of this Cupola conversation. Of course, we want everybody to stay safe as we go through the months ahead. Safety is definitely a priority. We encourage you, get educated on the topics, on the candidates, and the things that mean the most to you. And by all means, exercise your right to vote. Until we get to talk again, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.